Good afternoon. My name is Heather McLaughlin and I'm with Timmons Group. We are bringing you a lunchtime presentation about stormwater pollution prevention plans. This presentation was designed specifically for an architect's angle so that you guys understand better what the stormwater teams are doing on these projects, so you have a better understanding of the process. On the call today from our environmental team, we have Hunter Wines and Brian Bressinger. They'll be presenting the Lunch and Learn session for you today. We also have Steve Rao on the call. He is one of our civil engineers principals, and he is on the line to help us be a part of the transition between you as the architect and us as the engineer, and how all these parts and pieces come together to serve our clients better. Also, Brittany Harlow is on the call today. She is here from our marketing department. She is driving our train of our presentation today. So we thank you, Brittany, for being a part of our team as well. And again, I'm Heather McLaughlin with Timmons Group. My job here is to do business development and just help everybody along with everything that we do. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the call to Hunter and Brian and let them make their presentations. But I will share that there will be continuing education units coming to you after today's presentation, likely from Brittany. She will be sending that email to you later. And then also the presentation is broken into 3 sections. So what we'll do is we'll take a brief pause at the end of each section and give you an opportunity if you have any questions that come up during that part. Happy to address those at that time. Also, you're welcome to use the Q&A or the chat at the bottom of the screen to post those questions, and we can easily engage those questions along the way. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Hunter and Brian and let them show you the presentation. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Heather. Thank you.
Good morning, Heather.
Yeah, so I'm, like Heather said, I'm Hunter Wines. I'm in our environmental team here at Timmons Group, and I deal with a lot of the construction administration and construction compliance side of the environmental team here at Timmons. I am, there we go. Brian spearheads the ship here in the environmental team and kind of runs the construction group as well. And also on my team, we have Steve Vargo and Ben Crumrine. Both are licensed erosion sediment control inspectors, and Steve is actually a drone pilot as well, which adds a lot of value to the construction process, as Steve can fly the site before construction, during construction, and after construction for various photos or deliverables, or there are several kind of pieces that he can piece together for you in that process. So like Heather said, today we're going to break this down into kind of 3 parts to go through the stormwater pollution prevention plans. We're going to start off with a general overview of the construction general permit, which is kind of the regulatory guiding force behind stormwater pollution prevention plans. And then we'll dive into what actually goes into a stormwater pollution prevention plan. It's a long, wordy phrase, so if you hear me say SWPPP throughout the presentation, that's just an acronym for Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plans. Likely we'll be using that more than saying it out every time. And then we'll jump to the operator responsibilities. This is the piece that I feel like is really important as we're talking to our clients and talking to the project owners to know kind of who needs to be in charge where and who has what responsibilities throughout the life of the project. So the first thing that we'll start kind of high-level overview of what the construction general permit is Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, has a general permit for construction activities. General permit means that every 5 years, they evaluate this permit and they kind of make a blanket permit for construction activities. This all comes down from the EPA. The EPA regulates, stormwater discharges to water bodies, and they kind of have set the golden standard of construction activities disturbing more equal to or greater than 1 acre. So EPA delegates that authority down to the state, and the state of Virginia has the construction general permit to meet the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Systems requirements that the EPA has set forth. So this general permit cycle that we're in right now started in July of 2019, and it'll be valid through July of 2024. At that point, July 2024, DEQ will reevaluate the permit and see where there's any holes from the last 5 years and things that they may want to add. People who must apply for the construction general permit, this is often the first question that we get in kind of the design phase of a project, is do I need a construction general permit? And the answer is, if you're disturbing equal to or greater than 1 acre of land, then yes, you will need a construction general permit. However, in Virginia, we are unique, particularly on the East Coast, in the Chesapeake Bay localities, that the municipalities have the authority to make a more stringent requirement for a SWPPP for the site. So the construction general permit may not be necessary, but there still may be applicability for having a SWPPP on site. And that's generally based on a 2,500 square feet acres or 2,500 square feet disturbance threshold. So what DEQ has done, I kind of mentioned that it goes from the EPA down to DEQ. Well, DEQ doesn't have the bandwidth to administer this program across the entire state. So localities that have the ability to administer this program themselves have opted into being for being a VSMP authority. VSMP being the Virginia Stormwater Management Program. So on the next slide, I'll show a map of who has jurisdiction where and which localities have opted into the program and which are revert back to DEQ. If a locality doesn't administer the program themselves, then that jurisdiction falls back to DEQ and they administer the program. So we can see on this map that there's a large concentration of localities that administer this program at the locality level in Central Virginia and kind of the eastern southeast Hampton Roads region of Virginia. Particularly in the Hampton Roads region, a majority of that area discharges to the Chesapeake Bay, and those municipalities have the bandwidth to administer this program. So we have relationships with several of these localities to know the processes to get a VSMP permit or a construction general permit coverage in that locality. And it all depends on whether they all have different thresholds for land disturbance that will drive if a SWPPP is necessary for the project as well. On the next slide, this is a map of the Chesapeake Bay preservation areas. These are the localities that most of them opt into requiring a SWPPP at land disturbance greater than 2,500 square feet. So it just kind of gives you an idea of, a lot of Hampton Roads does have a more stringent requirement. So though a construction general permit from DEQ may not be necessary, a SWPPP still may be necessary for your site. So the way that the construction general permit works is, since it's kind of a blanket permit that the state administers, the way that they track who is operating under that general permit is through the VSMP registration statement. So that is a document that is filled out for the project that is then sent to either the locality if they're administering the program, or it's sent to DEQ and it's reviewed for completeness, and it goes into a database tracking system so that DEQ has a tracking of everybody who is having a construction activity under their general permit. And that's relevant because that information is then tracked for the state of Virginia. It goes into a database that knows where discharges are, what the size of the projects are, and it kind of helps them create a model for what they have to submit to the EPA to show compliance with the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System requirements that the EPA administers. So some things to note on the registration statement, this is kind of the very beginning, is knowing who the operator is. That generally is the owner of the project or the general contractor on the project who is going to be in charge of the day-to-day operations out there and will be signing off on activities for the construction site. Needs basic information, the name of the company, a contact for the company, an address, phone, email. Email has been really important with this new cycle because DEQ is switching to doing a lot of correspondence electronically in the 2019 to 2024 cycle. A new requirement is it must include a site map with the registration statement. So on that site map, it'll kind of be a rough layout of where you are in the landscape and then where your construction entrances are located for the project. That's important for DEQ because they need to know if they need to go out to do a compliance inspection, they want to know exactly where they have to drive to get onto the site and who to see. Basic project information, address and lat long in decimal degrees for the project needs to be on there. total acreage versus disturbed acreage. So this is a question we get often, is what is the difference between the two? Total acreage is generally the amount of land that is under control and under the common development for the site, whereas your disturbed acreage is usually scaled back a little bit. That's the area where you're actually disturbing and doing earthwork. Construction dates need to be included on that, which are an approximation of when you're going to start and when you're going to end. The 6th order HUC code is the hydrologic unit code. It's a breakdown that the state has made of the different watersheds and drainage areas across the state. So that kind of goes back to DEQ tracks where all of their construction activities are down to the watershed level, so that they know kind of the contributing factors to that watershed and the water quality in that watershed. The receiving waters goes with the hydrologic unit codes. Plan approval date. So when you get ENS plan approval, erosion and sediment control plan approval, that date goes on to the registration statement so that DEQ knows that plans have been approved for the site. Original signature, we get this question often, is can I digitally sign this document? And the answer is no, we cannot digitally sign this document. It has to be a wet signature, but it can be scanned back in. We don't have to receive originals on the registration statement. So then after the registration statement is filled out, that gets submitted to either DEQ or the local authority, whoever is administering jurisdiction on that project. And it goes into the system to start processing the coverage for the construction general permit. So that's kind of the high level overview of what guides needing a stormwater pollution prevention plan and kind of the regulatory background to why we have the construction general permit. The requirement of the construction general permit is a stormwater pollution prevention plan. And I'll stop right there for a second to see if Heather has fielded any questions that would be relevant to the first section.
I am checking the chat box at the moment. Not seeing anything, Hunter, at the moment. Give him just another minute. So far, so good. Continue on, Hunter.
Awesome, thank you. So we'll jump into, there we go. So the overview of SWPPP is that it is a requirement of the construction general permit, and mentioned on the VSMP registration statement that I was just talking about is you will check a box, has a stormwater pollution prevention plan been filled out for this site? So we'll kind of now dive into the meat and potatoes of what goes into the SWPPs. Like I said, this is a requirement of the construction general permit, part 2B, that lists all of the information that needs to be included in the SWPPs. So this is just kind of high level. We'll go into more detail of these, but general information, erosion and control plans, stormwater management plans, and pollution prevention plans are all kind of engineering drawings and engineering plans that will go into this. Requirements for nutrient and sediment impaired waters, PCB impaired waters, exceptional waters, and then just signatories for the project and who will be in charge. So we'll dive into those and see what is required of each of those. So the first requirement is general information. This is where our registration statement goes, that is filled out and signed and will be submitted to DEQ or the local authority. The notice of coverage is essentially once you submit your registration statement, what you get back from DEQ is what's called a notice of coverage. That's a coverage letter that says, we agree with what you have proposed here, and you are authorized to operate under this construction general permit. So that coverage letter needs to be placed in the SWPPP. It also needs to be posted on site right around the construction trailer. People, I see them post them, or like a construction board where all of the contact information is. That's one of the areas where that notice of coverage needs to be posted. The construction general permit is like a 30-page document that is DEQ language all about the stormwater pollution prevention plans, the registration statements, and all of the requirements to operate under that. That document doesn't change from project to project, but it does need to be included for reference in the SWPPP. A narrative description of the project needs to be included, something as simple as we are constructing a 30-unit residential apartment complex. We anticipate 1.5 acres of disturbance with the project. So not anything crazy, but just a general overview of the project that DEQ will assign to the project in their tracking system to know they can do a quick search and grab all the similar projects. And then the site plan, the basic map that I mentioned that has the location of the construction entrances, the overall limits of disturbance marked on that, and a general overview of where you are in the landscape. The next thing that's required is erosion and sediment control plans. Those are construction drawings that go into the plans. Each municipality has different requirements for what all goes into their ENS plans, so we can certainly help guide you in the right direction, or we have people who know that for each locality and what is required of that. Same thing with the stormwater management plans. They're an engineering drawing set that will be included in the SWP, because these two plan sets are referenced throughout the SWP so that people know, okay, this is where my erosion and sediment control plan is, phase 1 and phase 2. This is where my grading and drainage plan is. This is where my stormwater calculations are. Those have to be included in the SWP because they're referenced throughout. And then in both of those plans, there's generally a narrative describing construction sequencing, the basic calculations that went into stormwater calculations, and you can often find a narrative description of the project, the schedule, kind of the additional information that goes into the whole design process. A pollution prevention plan. A lot of municipalities in Hampton Roads and Central Virginia require a pollution prevention plan to be a slip sheet in the plan set. So that's just something where you will note on there, this is where the porta potties are located. This is where the waste receptacles are. This is where concrete washed out will be located. And there's a narrative description for all of those included on the pollution prevention plan, as well as a narrative description within the SWP that describes, this is our spill prevention measures. These are what we're going to do if we have fuels on site. Kind of all of the potential contaminants or pollution sources will be narratively described and laid out in the SWP. The next thing that needs to be identified is impaired waters. So in Virginia, we have a very good database that tracks impaired waters in the state. This is kind of the overall goal of when the EPA created the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. The overall goal is clean water, to simplify it. So in Virginia, we have a list of impaired waters. Those need to be clearly identified on a map. And if there are any of those projects within your project boundary or your project directly discharges to, that becomes relevant for the revised inspection schedule that I'll mention when we get to inspections. Qualified personnel needs to be identified. Qualified personnel is the person who will regularly be conducting the site inspections. So I'll go into more detail about the site inspection requirements, but basically to do a site inspection, you have to be at least a responsible land disturber in Virginia and maintain that certification. Their responsible land disturber is kind of the beginning stages to doing site inspections, and then you can progress through the courses to become more certified to do the inspections for certain situations. Delegation of authority needs to be identified. That's kind of the next step of important person on the project. Delegation of authority is the person who the operator of the project, like we mentioned, the owner or the general contractor, whoever is holding the general permit, can delegate that authority for the day-to-day operations down to the DA. This is the person who's responsible for updating the SWP, who makes sure it's maintained. If DEQ or the locality has any questions about it, they're going to go to that delegated authority if one has been designated. Also, the qualified personnel may not necessarily be able to sign the inspections. You have to be listed as a delegated authority or the operator to actually sign the weekly SWP inspections. Usually the general contractor is made the delegated authority from the owner of the project, or the person leading the project, or the financial interest, or whoever that may be, delegates that authority to the general contractor. The SWP must be signed by the operator or the delegated authority, showing that they are fully aware of all of their responsibility that is required by having the SWIP and their authority. Some other SWIP requirements that are needed to be in there are amendments, modifications, and updates. So these are important because oftentimes we know on a job or on a construction site, field changes need to happen. We need to add silt fence here. We need to add a longer construction entrance there. Things like that happen, or porta potties need to be moved. Those things go into the amendments, modifications, and updates logs to kind of keep a record of everything that's going on site that may not necessarily be needed to go through the plan revision process, but can be hashed out in the SWIP. Also with that, in Virginia, with our weather, there's a likelihood that controls are designed to work for the storms that they're designed for. We get 100-year storms more often than we would think we would in Virginia, so corrective actions are necessary sometimes. You know, a silt fence is undercut and sediment leaves the site. You know, there has to be a log of that initial release and then what the corrective actions were that were put in place to clean that up and restore the site to its conditions that it needs to be at. Any amendment or modification, update to the SWIP, any corrective action needs to be signed off by the operator or the delegated authority. Again, they're just acknowledging that they're in charge here and they're well aware of what's going on and they take responsibility for what's going on. A log of construction activities needs to be filled out. This is important for the kind of the milestones of the project. You know, we have perimeter controls are installed, interior clearing has commenced, preliminary grading, you know, erosion sediment phase 1 grading, erosion and sediment phase 2 grading, basins are installed, stabilization has begun. Those are kind of the things that go into the log of construction activities. A list of contractors on the site, the major contractors that will be there. So your environmental contractor that's doing your erosion and sediment install, your silt fence, your basins, those need to be listed. Your concrete contractor, your materials contractor, they just need to be listed in the SWIP so that if DEQ comes back and finds, okay, this concrete is a problem over here, they know who to get in contact with. A requirement of these SWIPs is that they're publicly available. So that needs to be posted somewhere within the SWIP binder, how people can access the SWIP, but also it needs to be posted clearly on the construction board so that people know who to contact if they want to review the SWIP. It's a publicly available document, so they can review that if they wish. Within the SWIP binder, there will be a transfer of ownership. This is relevant if the project changes hands at any point. You can transfer coverage of the construction general permit from one party to another through that transfer of ownership form. And then at the end of construction, as soon as everything is done, the site is stabilized, DEQ has been out there, and they say, looks good, you're growing good vegetation, everything's where it's supposed to be. We don't anticipate any other construction-related releases from this project. You can submit a notice of termination, and that will terminate your coverage under the construction general permit. That becomes relevant because you don't want to keep these permits open any longer than you have to. There's yearly maintenance fees associated with these. So I forgot to mention with the registration statements, there's an upfront cost based on a disturbance threshold on how much it costs to submit this to DEQ or the locality. And then every year there's a maintenance fee that goes and is charged for the project for keeping the project open, and just DEQ recouping, monitoring this project. So as soon as you can submit a notice of termination, generally better for the project. So I mentioned SWIP inspections. These are kind of the big ticket item. The reason that we have a SWIP is to document inspections. One of the biggest things that my team has noted with construction sites is one of two things. Either inspections aren't being conducted at the appropriate intervals, and that allows a lot of margin of error if the site's not being readily evaluated, and the controls aren't the controls being silt fence, basins, construction entrances, check dams, all of those things aren't being maintained at the frequency at which they should to be working as designed. That all comes back to the inspections. So as a requirement of the construction general permit, there are two thresholds of inspection frequencies. If you're project discharges to an impaired water body, you're required to inspect the site every 4 days or every 5 days and within 24 hours of a storm event. A measurable storm event in Virginia is a 1/4 of an inch. So and a lot of our storms are above that. So we often advise people to elect the every 4 days inspection frequency. It just allows a more consistent time on site. You know that every 4 business days, you're going to be out there evaluating the site, and you're not just dependent on a rain event happening, which could make you go out there 2 or 3 times a week if you elect to do the every 5 day schedule. If you're if your project does not discharge to any impaired water bodies, you can revise the inspection frequency to be every 5 days or every 10 days and within 24 hours of a storm event. I will say, in my experience, a lot of projects in Virginia, particularly Hampton Roads, Central Virginia, kind of the eastern side of the state, likely discharge to an impaired water body, particularly because we have the Chesapeake Bay and eventually downstream of all of our projects. So like I said, here we recommend people be on the every 4 days inspection schedule, and that not only covers the basis for the construction general permit, but it ensures that your site is going to stay in compliance and some bigger issues aren't going to come up from that. So these inspections must be kept in the SWP binder. They need to be filled out by qualified personnel, but then signed by the operator or the delegated authority. That's a big one because the operator or the delegated authority theoretically should be reviewing those inspections, and they should be knowing what's going on their site, where their deficiencies are, what they need to clean up before the next inspection is an ideal sequence. Oftentimes, in my experience, they don't review those as often. So we send them, updates with photos and emails and locations of where they need to go and shore things up. The SWP records should be kept for a minimum of 3 years following construction. That's just in case something happens after the notice of termination has been submitted or the project is left open longer than it should have. It's just good to have those records that, hey, we were diligent about our record keeping. Here's our inspection log. Here's when everything was closed out. We have that on hand. So that kind of covers the meat and potatoes of what goes into the stormwater pollution prevention plans. I'll stop there for another question session.
Thank you, Hunter. That was great. That's a lot of information, certainly, and I'll give the attendees a minute to make any questions or comments. I did note no one has posted anything to this point, so we're waiting. I think we can go ahead and continue on, Hunter. Thank you.
Okay. Great. So this is the part where the operator's responsibilities is where we get a lot of our questions about the stormwater pollution prevention plans. People often want to know, okay, I've been told that I need this, now what am I on the hook for? And the operator, like I said, is usually the financial entity or the owner of the project that is driving everything for the site, the developer. And their first responsibilities are signatures. They need to be the one listed on the registration statement. They need to be signing the SWP binder. They need to be delegating authority to somebody. Say the owner of the project is based out of Maine and they're doing a project in Virginia Beach. It would probably be smart of them, unless they're going to send someone down from Maine, to be on site to give that delegated authority to their contractor and have their contractor be in charge of maintaining the site and signing off on inspections. That's another thing they have to do, is sign off on inspections unless they give that authority to their delegated authority. The operator
Hunter,
is yes.
If I could interrupt, there is a good question that came in before you move forward. Can you talk about the difference between impaired and non-impaired waters, please?
Yeah. So in Virginia, impaired waters and non-impaired waters. Impaired waters are water bodies that have been identified by DEQ in their water quality, I believe it's called their water quality impact report, that lists parameters for impaired water bodies. So it could be suspended solids, it could be a PCB impairment, it could be a phosphorus or nitrogen impairment. There's a list of all of these impairments that a water body can be impaired for. And if our projects are discharging to those, they become they are viewed more stringent, or they're reviewed more closely, as we don't want to be contributing something from the construction site to that water body that it's already impaired for, is really why DEQ monitors those. A non-impaired water body is just simply not impaired. There are studies done, may have been studies done on it, or may not have been evaluated yet to know if that water body has any impairments for that particular reach that they have evaluated. Brian, do you want to speak to that one anymore?
So in the state of Virginia, water body, there's 6 designated uses that it needs to meet. DEQ readily assesses, these water bodies to make sure that they meet those 6 designated uses. And if for some reason they don't meet one of those uses, say it's for fish or shellfish or recreational uses, they will sort of label that stream as impaired. And then they come up with what's called a TMDL, total maximum daily load, which is essentially a pollution diet. A healthy stream is able to process a natural load of sediment, but if a water body is identified as impaired for any particular reason, it's not able to process that sediment and pollutant load like a healthy stream would. So there's they will do these studies and set and establish certain thresholds or limits, these total maximum daily loads for what the stream is able to handle. A lot of the increased inspection frequency is based on sensitivities to these waters, and making sure that they're particularly sensitive to just making sure that we're doing perimeter inspections to check sediment loads to those identified water bodies on a more frequent basis. And Hunter mentioned earlier, generally kind of, if you're, 95, east of 95, generally in the Tidewater community, if you're draining to the Chesapeake Bay in and of itself has a total maximum daily load or pollution diet that's been established to clean the Chesapeake Bay up by the year 2025. So if you're in that watershed, that's why a lot of those sites, depending on your location, you may sort of automatically fall into that increased inspection frequency based on the Chesapeake Bay being identified as an impaired water body.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so Jack, I think that was Jack. Jack, if you want more detail, we can try to dive in more, but that's kind of an overall difference of what an impaired water body versus an unimpaired water body would be. So back to the operator.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Yep. And I guess just one additional comment before we move on. There is an interactive map on DEQ's website, and we can follow up with a link to that after the presentation that allows you to scroll through that map, and it's sort of GIS-based interactive. You can look in the proximity of your site, and you can determine whether or not the water body that your site is discharging into is listed as being impaired.
Yeah, that's a great resource that we use often. I think that a lot of municipalities now who administer this program on the local level have a list of impaired water bodies within their jurisdiction that they readily track and monitor with DEQ. And they will, part of the county process, as things kind of flow traditionally in the United States with jurisdiction over things, EPA sets a standard, DEQ can make it at least that stringent or more stringent. And in Virginia, generally we've made it more stringent, more restrictive than EPA made it. And then localities that have been given authority can make it more stringent or at least as stringent as DEQ. Particularly in the Chesapeake Bay localities, they're going to make things tighter and harder, not harder, but there's going to be more things that are required to get the construction general permit. So they make you list out any of the impaired water bodies in addition to the Chesapeake Bay that your project may be discharging to. And it goes back to that tracking database that they want to know, okay, this project is located just above this creek, and that creek has an impairment for recreational use. So we want to make sure that we know that that project isn't discharging anything to further impair that recreational use for that stream channel. So yeah, the operator is also in charge of the registration fees and annual maintenance fees. Those are the fees that I mentioned earlier. That there is a fee worksheet that DEQ has provided that we can figure out based on, 1 to 5 acres, 5 to 10 acres, 10 to 50, and then 50 to 100, and then over 100. There's different dollar amounts that are assigned to the project just to submit the registration statement, and then again for the annual maintenance fees. And that is generally the operator's responsibilities. You do have the option to note someone who will be in charge of the financial sureties for the project. In the registration statement process, it will ask who the operator is, and then directly below that, it'll say who will billing information be sent to. And oftentimes the operator will be the one handling the fees for the project, but if they're not, we have the option to insert someone else as the person responsible for that. The operator is in charge of submitting the notice of termination at the end of the project. I think that that's something that we get a lot of questions on as well, as projects will linger and they'll sit, and then people will be continually paying these maintenance fees. Well, they're like, this project's been done for a year or two now. Whose responsibility is that? We like to step in, and when we're a part of the projects through the end, to say, hey, you're getting close to the end, let's submit the notice of termination. Sometimes people handle the stormwater pollution prevention plans and the inspections on their own. We're not as privy to the project schedule, and oftentimes the notice of termination does get overlooked, and then people don't remember to submit that until they get hit with the fee for their maintenance fees. So that's a good thing to know and point out to our clients and operators kind of throughout the process of letting them see the full spectrum of what they're on the hook for, that they have a running ticker to know that needs to be submitted at some point. And then the operator is ultimately responsible for the SWPPP. They're the one who makes sure everything is present, updated, and maintained regularly so that DEQ doesn't have too much to come back and push back on them on. Okay, so this is something that we like to pass along. My team does a good bit of these stormwater pollution prevention plans. We help a lot of our clients and we help a lot of our internal engineering team fill out these SWPPPs and the registration statements. And they often will pass along, here's my basic plan. What do you need from me? And this is usually what we say back. We need to know who the operator is going to be. We need to know that company name, basic information. Municipalities, or a lot of them, are switching to wanting all of the project information up front before they approve the SWPPP binder. So the SWPPP binder also has to be approved by DEQ, or if the locality is the authority, they will want to review that before the pre-construction meeting so that it can be kind of hashed out any discrepancies in there. Of recent, they've been requesting that all of the information be filled out. We can't fill out delegated authority information at the pre-construction meeting anymore. They kind of want to have that in their database tracking it before we even get to the pre-con meeting. So they need to know who the qualified personnel is, i.e. who's going to be doing the inspections, who is the delegated authority if the operator is giving one, and then basic contractor information. Obviously, we know throughout the course of construction, things change, and we may not have all of our contractors up front, but generally speaking, if we're at a pre-construction meeting, we have at least the GC, so that will be the only contractor listed there, and that's okay. It's someone who they can go back to and reference. We need to have the erosion and sediment control plans and the stormwater management plans. Like I mentioned earlier, those plan sets are referenced throughout the SWPPP document. There's several areas where the SWPPP will require where are the limits of grading, and then you'll reference, sheet blank, it's the grading and drainage plan. So those are referenced, and they change project to project. So we generally need to have those. I like to ask for them to be not necessarily the 10% plans, but 30%, 50%. Once we get to that point that we know that sheet numbers aren't really changing that much, we're just kind of hashing out details within those sheets, we can start working with that to prepare the stormwater pollution prevention plan. The plan cover sheet has a ton of information on it that's very relevant to the SWIP. We take a lot of that information and put it into the SWIP itself and the registration statement. The cover sheets generally do a good job of documenting the project well. We need estimated dates of construction for start and end. And they don't have to be exact. You know, if we have a project that we're working on right now and you know that November we're going to go online and we'll have our pre-con meeting sometime here in the next month or two, we can put on that registration statement, you know, November 1, 2020, give you however many months you may need, 18, 24 months to get the project done. And we put that at the end as a date of end of construction. Acreage of disturbance. Sometimes this one's a little bit harder to find if it's not explicitly written somewhere. We can definitely go in and calculate it, but if that's available and you know that number, it's great to just provide that up front. So this is kind of the ideal sequence of events for the stormwater pollution prevention plans. The engineer team or the architecture team, you know, kind of begins with plans, and then plans are nearing approval. You know, like I said, at least the sheet numbers aren't changing. And then we can reach out and get the required information for the operator, the basic information that we need to fill out the registration statement to get that running. And we can start preparing the registration statement and the SWIP. So once we do that, we'll submit the registration statement to the DEQ or the local authority, and they'll start processing that in the background while construction plans are being approved. And then once we have an approved registration statement, we have our coverage letter in hand, we have our SWIP binder filled out and ready to go. That's presented at a pre-construction meeting. Everybody looks through it just to acknowledge their responsibilities on the project, and then construction begins. And then this is where really the meat and potatoes of the SWIP comes in. Is, you know, the inspections are conducted at the required interval, things are updated on the log of major activities, any sort of amendments, modifications, if corrective action is necessary, those are all put into the SWIP. So it would be more relevant to have this be a really long block within these little triangles. The first, you know, 5 or 6 triangles happen relatively quickly on top of each other, and then there's the duration of construction. So at the very end, we terminate the SWIP and VSMP so that the client or the project owner is no longer required to submit or pay an annual maintenance fee, more or less. So we'll close that out. And I think that is it. We will open it back up for questions. And my contact information is listed on here. If you heard something that you want to talk about more project specific or something that we can help you all with, like I said, my team here at Timmins, we do a lot of these stormwater pollution prevention plans. We help with registration statements. The majority of our questions are fielded through, hey, here's my project, here's what I have going on, what do I need? And we would love to help, you know, kind of work through that process. So contact information is there if you want to reach out ever and ask more questions about this that you didn't get to today. So.
Thank you, Hunter and Brian. I appreciate your time on this, guys. I'm gonna, while we're waiting to see if there's any questions from the audience, I might engage Steve Rao if you're available. Perhaps you could talk about the timing that you often, being the engineer of record on a project with architects, talk about how this part of the project gets clustered into your portion of the project.
Sure. You know, Hunter put up a nice little timeline there, and you know, an ideal project will follow that same timeline. Some of the things that we run into from the engineering side of things is a lot of localities are now wanting to have fully approved construction plans before they will take that registration statement. Even though they are the local authority, they still submit it to DEQ. And they won't do that until the construction plans are fully approved. So from that point, it's typically a week or two. Does that sound about right, Hunter? A week or two by the time it gets to DEQ before you're authorized to move forward?
Yeah, it does. It usually takes about a week or two to for DEQ to process it. And that's a great point, Steve. The localities, even though they do have authority, they still put this into a state database, and DEQ is who will actually be sending you your coverage letter. So that lead time is about 2 weeks before DEQ will send you that letter.
So then the other thing I'll comment on regarding schedule is that I work on a lot of projects that have to go through public bidding. And so, you know, by the time we get our construction plans approved, we're putting out on the street bid documents. And by the time we get bids back in and award the project to a general contractor and his team, they're ready to put a shovel in the ground and get working. But if they're the ones that are listed as the delegated authority, then that process is delayed to starting at that point, and it seems as if we're sitting still for a couple of weeks waiting for that to happen. Now, it used to be that we could list the owner or the engineer of record as the delegated authority and get the process started, and then once a contractor had been selected, then we would transfer that over to the contractor. But it seems like we're getting more and more pushback on that. Hunter, have you seen that as well? They really don't like to do the transfer. They want to do it once and once only.
They do. They especially like Steve mentioned, you know, we used to put even us, Timmons Group, as the delegated authority or the operator at the beginning, and the localities and the state just kind of jumped on that, hey, you guys are just pushing this through. You know, we're not actually getting the people who need to be in charge of this listed on there. So that's kind of the pushback that they have provided to us is, hey, are you going to actually be doing the site inspections? Are you going to be the one responsible for compliance out here? Because that's who we really want as the operator and the delegated authority. They don't necessarily want to go after Timmons Group, for example, for some non-compliance that we're not even actively on the site anymore. We just did the design plans. So they do generally, and that's kind of the way that we were moving in the approval process of this that I mentioned is they want to have all of the information up front now. And that just echoes what Steve said is one of their biggest hurdles is, I mean, I know that in 2 or 3 of the localities that I regularly work in, they won't even consider the SWPPP complete until you have all of these signatures and they've identified contractors, they've identified who the delegated authority is, and the delegated authority is actually the GC, you know, the person on the site every day. So I do echo that. We see that a lot.
So that's our biggest challenge, is making sure we don't hold the project, the start of construction up for this, that we want to get it moving forward as quickly as possible. Hunter, it looks like you got a couple questions coming in.
We do. One question here was, how has this process changed in the last decade or so, and how do you see it evolving over the next decade?
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
I can jump in and field that one a little bit. So, you know, over the last decade or so, the stormwater construction general permit has changed. It originally was with DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, and then DEQ took it over. So it is continually evolving. It's getting a little bit more, you know, complex. I think it's starting to become more intertwined, or what we've seen on sites with where you have, you know, erosion and sediment control, discharges to surface waters, wetlands or streams, and there's starting to be some overlap. You know, we get wetland impact permits, and then we have you know, our erosion sediment control or stormwater construction general permit, and where there's been failures with erosion and sediment control and there's been discharges in wetland or streams, it's like, you know, hey, who's kind of the regulating body? Is it an erosion sediment control issue, or now is it a wetland permit compliance issue? You know, we haven't done anything on site in the wetlands. It's just that we had a release from our site. So getting a little bit more complicated or intertwined with wetland permitting. I also see, just like everything else, a lot of the other states have moved forward with digital processes for submitting online, where they call them notice of intent, which is the same as the VSMP registration statement. A little surprised that DEQ hasn't moved to more of a digital submittal process and tracking process so far. And one of the reasons, I guess it's a little bit different, is because you have all these local authorities. So everyone's kind of, been passing the buck. As Hunter mentioned earlier, the program resides with the EPA, but now we've been delegated, or DEQ's been a delegated authority. They've passed that responsibility now onto the localities. And I guess one thing to note, Hunter mentioned the registration fees for these VSMP permits. They're pretty hefty, and they're hefty because those are the funds that they use to basically fund their program. So a small site that you're disturbing, a little over an acre, that registration statement fee is $2,700. If you are disturbing more than 100 acres, there's a $9,600 registration fee. So that's kind of how they fund the programs. There is some more increased involvement with DEQ moving into more of an oversight role. A percentage of that fee goes to them to administer the program, also to handle the areas where they are the delegated authority. Most of the local authorities, there's probably more, because it's easier for the localities to staff, as that responsibility has been pushed over to them. So there's some more, I'd say, active inspections from the compliance side in the local authorities than there is the state, just because the state doesn't really have as many resources as some of the localities to do some of those inspections.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. Looks like we have one other question that's come in. What are the biggest problems that you're seeing in the field with SWPPP issues?
I'll let Hunter comment on this one, but one of the biggest things, and we end up doing a lot of third-party VSMP inspections. Most of the time, contractors will do, your site work or your grading contractor will do the erosion and sediment control inspections themselves, and they have a tendency of not policing themselves the best. So some third-party oversight goes a long way, just to make sure that the contractor's implementing the measures that they're supposed to. We've seen a lot of issues on site with, erosion sediment control is only good if you maintain it. A lot of contractors will install it initially and do zero maintenance to it. When there's zero maintenance done to those measures, they're more prone to failure. The other thing is having a knowledgeable person on site, potentially a third-party inspector, to make sure that the erosion sediment control sequencing is representative of what is in the engineering plans. Erosion and sediment controls only work effectively if they're used in combination with each other. We've seen a lot of sites that have had erosion and sediment control issues because they, the basins have been not constructed properly. The sequencing gets out of schedule, or in a lot of cases, with the phasing, sometimes there's sediment basins or sediment traps or other things that are ultimately going to be filled for construction of later phases of the site that never get built. So by having an active set of eyes on the construction site to make sure the contractors are following the erosion sediment control sequencing and doing the maintenance is sort of the critical or key piece into making sure that to keep your site in compliance and avoid issues where you have discharges off site into wetlands or streams. There's consequences with those once they get into water bodies downstream in terms of warning letters, notices of violations, civil penalties. So it's really kind of critical to make sure that you're containing and keeping the sediment on your project on the project site.
Yeah, and I would echo a lot of what Brian said. Spending a good amount of time out on construction sites. Some of the bigger issues that I see are maintenance. That's the biggest one that we see. It's the one that we really hammer home before a site kicks off, and then throughout the duration of construction is, we put in silt, for example, we put in silt fence. Well, silt fence does its job by stopping silt. And then if we're not maintaining that, it's going to be ineffective after that silt reaches half of the level up the silt fence. So it's the constant maintenance that's required. These aren't like a set it and forget it. And far too often on construction sites, I see You know, they bring in their clearing contractor, they bring in their perimeter controls contractor, and then they leave the site. They don't stay for the duration of construction. And that's a problem because then no one knows who's cleaning out these controls. And then like Brian said, another big ticket item that we see is people like to cut corners, generally speaking, save $1 here to put a permanent basin in instead of putting in the 2 traps that will be converted to a permanent basin. Whereas there's a lot of calculations and a lot of planning that goes into the drainage area changing and the amount of land cover, you know, that's open, the bare soil that goes into, okay, we're putting a trap here in phase 1 of erosion sediment, and in phase 2 we'll convert it to a permanent basin. And those things are often overlooked, kind of the sequence of construction Brian mentioned. And then just one that I've been seeing more recently as a problem is a lack of a holistic understanding of what's going on the project. You know, we have wetlands on site, we have streams on site, we have grading here, we have panel, you know, building or panels going over here, or whatever it may be. Everyone needs to be communicating clearly that, yes, getting our project done on time and as fast as possible, and, you know, with limited cost, unexpected costs is very important, but so is making sure that we're protecting the things that we need to be protecting. We're not disturbing more land than we're supposed to. We're not letting sediment get off site, because what people are learning now is that ends up costing a lot more money than it would have been to just install things the first time through. And that's one of the bigger things about SWPPs and really environmental and the way that environmental plays into construction is people kind of sometimes think of it as an afterthought, or, okay, we'll check those boxes with environmental and then we'll move forward. But realistically, DEQ and the Army Corps of Engineers and all of these localities have a lot of mechanisms that can make environmental compliance issues become very expensive for your project. So it is worth the effort on the front end to put things in properly and maintain them and spend that amount of money versus what these civil penalties or fines or warnings could end up being in the future. So, and as far as the actual SWPPP binder on site, things that I often don't see is people don't log the sequence of construction. They don't make dates of, you know, when big activities happen, which is hard to go back and reference. You know, say we cleared the land on this day, well, then we had a major rain event, you know, 2 days later, but 6 months down the road, we're wondering why are we finding all this sediment off site? Well, it's nice to know kind of the sequence of things and when they have happened, so that we can go back and reference that to kind of do some investigation and figure out, okay, well, we were in the process of clearing there. We may have not had this control in yet that wasn't going to slow down this water, and that could kind of help us create a narrative back to the agencies and things. So within the SWPPP binder, I don't see a lot of the log of construction activities out there. Inspections generally are done. It's hard to tell from reading someone else's inspection how well, you know, how much effort they put into that. So that's kind of the big tickets I see out there.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. And in respect for everyone's time, you have finished right on time with our Q&A. We have no outstanding questions at the moment. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. I've put a note in the chat box there that you will be receiving a CEU unit for your AIA credits. And from Brittany, I believe those will be directly, Brittany, correct me if I'm wrong, those will be submitted directly to AIA if you provided her your AIA numbers.
Yes, that's correct. And so I will submit it to AIA, and I will also send an email with your certificate of completion for attending today.
Super. Thank you so much, Brittany. Gentlemen, thank you for your time today and your presentation. Everyone else on the line, thank you so much for sticking in there. Feel free to drop Hunter a question if you have it. His email address is right there on the screen for you. And we look forward to seeing you again sometime in the future. Have a great day.
Thanks.